This is a quick video lecture on the first part of The Handmaid's Tale. It's really intended for anybody that's interested in The Handmaid's Tale, but in particular, students in my English 101 class at Shoreline Community College, but, whoever. This is really, this first one, I don't know if I'll do more, but, so The Handmaid's Tale, this is the book. Hulu has a version coming out here in a couple weeks. So I just wanted to give kind of a background or basis for understanding The Handmaid's Tale, because I know it's confusing. There are a lot of characters. There's a lot going on. So we'll begin with the setting. So the setting is Gilead. And Gilead is a new state or country that is the former United States. I believe it's Cambridge, Massachusetts. In the near future now, near future is relative. We have to keep in mind that Margaret Atwood wrote this in the late 1980s, and she says, well, she was living in West Berlin, so 1985 or so is when it was published. So the society itself has been restructured, and we'll find out a little bit later how it's been restructured. We know for sure that women are now forbidden to have jobs of their own. They can't have money. Further, there's a sort of pseudo-religious type of military dictatorship in place. At the top of the hierarchy are the commanders. It's a heavily patriarchal society in some ways. So, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. We can think of the commanders themselves as kind of politicians or something like that. They're high-ranking military or political officials. And their real title is Commanders of the Faithful. Again, kind of get that religious component. These guys dress all in black, have nice houses and plenty of servants. So they're kind of the top of the food chain. They're not all equivalent. In fact, we find out a little bit later that some commanders are of higher status than others. So beneath them a little bit, give or take, are beneath the commanders are these guys called the Eyes. And the Eyes are basically a type of secret police. They ride around in big black vans and pick people up for breaking the rules. These guys, and I use guys intentionally because women can't hold jobs, remember? So they're basically like the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, all rolled into one. And some of them are undercover. So because any male could potentially be an eye, everybody has to mind their P's and Q's. It's sort of a way to control things. Even, I guess we do find out that the handmaids, one spies on another, so nobody knows who to talk to, and so it sort of keeps everybody distant from each other. Everybody sort of keeps everybody at arm's length. So beneath that, the Eyes and the commanders are these guys, the Angels, and the Angels are soldiers. They are fighting for Gilead, and because they're fighting for Gilead, they have a pretty good status. Not so good as the commanders. They're able to marry. They are theoretically on track to becoming commanders someday, as it says in the book, if they live long enough and are lucky enough. So they're not guaranteed, but we kind of think of this hierarchy so that the Angels feed into the commanders. And it's sort of intentionally abstract or uncertain, I think, how the Eyes fit into this. So at the bottom of the male side of the hierarchy are the Guardians. So the Guardians do basically everything. So they do all the grunt work. We see them manning checkpoints. We see them helping in the wives' gardens. We see them working at stores such as All Flesh. On page 20, there's something where Atwood describes them like this. She says, quote, "The Guardians aren't real soldiers. They're used for routine policing and other menial functions, digging up the commander's wife's gardens, for instance, and they're either stupid or older or disabled or very young, apart from the ones that are eyes incognito." So they're not the cream of the crop, these guys. Maybe some of them, if they're younger, might end up as angels. Maybe that's kind of the ideal trajectory for them. Some of them, as she points out, are probably spies. They're eyes incognito, right? So undercover. So we learn that the guardians aren't able to have wives. In fact, they're not able to touch women at all. They can't marry, and they live in military-style barracks. So these guys don't really have anything. They just have the hope that maybe at some point they'll advance. Uh, Now, in addition, there are other people that don't necessarily fit into one of these four categories. Um, in particular, we know that there are doctors or specialists who specialize in helping the handmaids or checking out the handmaids to make sure that they're healthy. Um, and then we know that there are other sort of jobs like the chauffeur, Nick, right? Um, who seems to have a pretty decent life. I mean, he's kind of on par with the Marthas, and we'll talk about here in a second. And that he has a job with the commander. He lives above the garage, and his job is simply to keep the Whirlwind, the car, nice and shiny, and to drive the commander around. And again, we'll talk more about Nick here in a minute. So that's the patriarchal side. Now, in terms of being a traditional patriarchy, it doesn't seem to be quite so, in that all men are above all women. And I say that because there does seem to be a way in which the women are tiered sort of under the men, but at different levels as well. So at the top of the food chain for the women are the commander's wives. Now, the commander's wives dress all in blue. They're the most fortunate of the women, I believe, in that they're living luxury. They still can't have jobs. They still can't have their own money. They can't read for pleasure, as far as we know. There is a comment, as somebody pointed out in class, that Serena Joy has read Offred's file. So there is some limited reading they can do, maybe for functional status. So, in addition to that, these women, their status in and of itself is not their own. It's really predicated, it's really based on the fact that they are commander's wives. So we could assume if commander has a heart attack, boom, done. She's going on. She's going to be a Martha. She's going to do something else, right? We don't know enough to know what happens in that case. But they do have, they're able to dismiss the guardians, as Serena Joy does when Offred first arrives. And of course, Serena Joy has a guardian that's helping her in the garden. So she's able to boss the guardians around. Underneath that, things get a little bit tangled. So I'm actually going to go to the handmaids next, because they occupy a weird status. I mean, this society isn't perfectly tiered in a caste system, as far as I can tell, and things do get a little bit murky. So the next position, if we consider the handmaids, they do have a special status, but they really still don't have any privileges or rights that we know of. In fact, they got basically nothing, and we've talked about this in class. They don't have any possessions, and each time they move to a new commander, their name changes. So I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here from my notes, but Offred is really of Fred, right? Because she belongs to Fred. So we can assume then, naturally, that the commander's name is Fred. Of Warren belongs to Warren of Glenn, so on, right? So these handmaids don't even have their own name, and we talked about this a bit in class as well. We never learn Offred's real name. There's maybe once where she comes close at the birth, where she almost whispers her name to another handmaid that's there, but they get cut off, so we never actually see that. Now the question comes up, and maybe we talked about this briefly in class, but the handmaids are chosen because they've broken some law. It's not something that women would aspire to, and I think for those of us that have read the book thus far, we know why most people would not necessarily aspire to this job. They're women who did something bad, so they had affairs, or they had a child out of wedlock, or they were married more than once, I think. It does explain it a little bit later in the book, a little bit past where we are with chapter 22, 23. So these women are picked up and they're sort of offered, okay, you have a choice. You can either go to the colonies, which is obviously not desirable, or you can be a handmaid. So those that choose to become a handmaid are sent to the Rachel and Leah Center, also called the Red Center, where they are taught how to be handmaids. So it's less so of a teaching and more of an indoctrination. Um, the training is mostly them being fed religious tracts, religious things that are supposedly from the Bible, and this narrative that they are lucky to be handmaids because being a handmaid protects them from the evils of men. Sexual assault, sexual abuses, all of these things. Um, so the handmaids are then assigned to a commander. So the commanders don't get to pick their handmaids. It's not as though the commander gets to go out and look at a lineup and say, I want that handmaid. As far as we know, we never have any indication that that's the case. So the handmaids are assigned. I believe, and we can double check this, that the handmaids are assigned for 2-year stints. If they get pregnant and have a healthy child, we don't know quite what happens, but they're released from that duty as far as we know. And correct me if I'm wrong. If somebody sees this, bring it up in class or mention it on discussion board or post underneath. After those 2 years, if they haven't gotten pregnant, they're shuffled off to another commander. Now, they can only do this 3 times. If they fail to have a child, or 3 times, a healthy child, then they're shipped to the colonies anyway. Now, one of the important things to remember here is that it's never, the fact that the handmaid has not gotten pregnant is never blamed on the male. In fact, the men being in charge have decided that it's illegal to say that men can be sterile. It's only ever going to be the woman's fault. We can also, as a tangent here, think that not all commanders have handmaids, because some commanders' wives are able to have children. The handmaids are only assigned to commanders whose wives have not been able to have kids. So that's where it goes. The baby has to be strong and healthy. If it's not, if it's an unbaby, then it's back to the drawing board, right? It's probably because of all of this and the lack of hope and the lack of ownership that many of the handmaids' rooms are devoid of anything that they could use to commit suicide, which Offred refers to as the other escape into oneself. So mirrors are removed, hooks on the walls are removed, chandeliers are removed, razors are removed. So the handmaids are watched very, very carefully because of this. They're considered a commodity. In fact, Aunt Lydia, it's either Aunt Lydia or Aunt Elizabeth refers to them as pearls. And later on, we'll discover that they're kind of considered a national treasure. So even Offred considers this, I think, at one point. He sort of mentions the idea of suicide. Okay, so moving on then to the Marthas. So the Marthas are basically just female servants in the commander's households. They do the cooking, the cleaning, right, all of that stuff. They wear light green, as where the commanders wear black, the commander's wives wear blue, handmaids clearly wear red. Marthas wear a green that's somewhat like that of the guardians. It seems like they have a job, but they're not getting paid for it. They are essentially getting room and board, right? So there's that. Now, I would say not quite the last rung on the female side of the caste system are the Econo wives, and these are poorer women at kind of the bottom of the food chain, or the female food chain of Gilead. They have to do basically all the running of the household themselves. So they basically take the place of the Martha, the wife, and the handmaid, and we really never learn much more about them. I mean, the only group that we learn the sort of backstory of is are the handmaids, right? We learn that why they become handmaids, but Martha's we don't know. And of course to go back, if I didn't mention it, so the Marthas, to be clear, in Offred's household are Rita and Cora. Okay. Underneath that, the very, very bottom, are the unwomen. And unwomen are, well, it's never really clearly defined. That's anybody that doesn't fit into those. So we could assume if you're presented with a choice, do you want to be a handmaid? Do you want to go to the colony? And you say, F that, I don't want to be a handmaid. I'll go to the colony, labeled unwoman. So there you go. Now, punishment is another big thing that we need to talk about in this society. The society is run, as I said, as sort of a semi-patriarchal military dictatorship. And as such, there's pretty severe punishments for everything. Being caught violating the law, either explicitly or by one of the eyes, right? I guess that would also be explicitly. Could result in death at a salvaging. Now, I just want to point out one thing quickly before we continue with the salvaging, which is one woman no longer can't be a witness. There has to be two women in order to be a witness, which I find fascinating. So it kind of reminds us of the 3/5 agreement, or compromise, whatever it was, in U.S. history. Anyway, going back to salvaging. So salvaging is basically a mass public execution. Those that are killed are judged guilty, and we don't really know the process to that because we never see it, but we can assume that it's probably not fair. Those people are killed and hung from the wall around the church. And we learn of their crimes because they wear these placards on their chest that have images. Again, no words in this society. Words have been deemed sort of corrupting influence. So we learn that gender treachery is one, which is basically homosexuality. We learn that belonging to the non-state religious groups, Catholics, Quakers, anything like that, can result in salvaging, will result in the salvaging. And then past crimes, such as doctors who in the time before carried out abortions, can be salvaged now if somebody turns them in, right? So stakes are high, right? And there are men's salvagings and there are women's salvagings, because even that's segregated. Okay, so quickly, let's go over the main characters. We've already sort of talked about some of them. And if you've read the book and been in class, you've already heard these names, but we'll go over them anyway, just to maybe clarify a little bit. So Offred is our narrator and protagonist. She's the one telling us the story. She never reveals her real name, and she keeps that close to her. It's a secret, right? Likely something that she feels defines her, in my opinion. And it's really the one thing that she can possess that's hers other than her memories, right? So one of the downsides of the handmaids is they really can't own anything. They have their clothes, and that's it. Otherwise, they're put in a room on their own with nothing to do except for trips to the doctor, the daily walk to the market, and then the ceremony. So bear that in mind. We know that prior to the creation of Gilead, that Offred was a college student, right? She talks about living in the dorms and studying, so she's educated. We know that she had a job, right? And we know that after an affair with Luke left his wife and married Offred. Sometime after that, they had a daughter who's also not named, and it's because of a botched escape attempt from Gilead that Offred was captured, separated from Luke and her daughter. I believe it says in there that she served with two previous commanders, although we know very little about them. And we could assume in many ways that she's pretty average for a handmaid. I don't think that there's anything to indicate to us that she's significantly different somehow. Yeah, I think that's most. I mean, that's Offred in a nutshell, right? I guess the one thing that I will say is that the one thing, and we talked about this in class, that's really keeping her going is her hope that at some point she'll be reunited with Luke and her daughter. And if it weren't for that, she would probably give up. Um, and when she has the time to herself in her room, this is where she goes in her brain, as she goes back to those memories. Um, the next, I mean, it's hard to tear them out in some sort of logical way, but we'll go to the commander next. We know that his name is Fred because Offred is of Fred, but we never really learn much about him. We know that he's a commander, that he works long hours, and he must be powerful, but he's not the most powerful dude because we learn that other commanders might have more status. He has silver hair, so he's a little bit older. Best guess is that he was probably somebody important prior to Gilead, right? I mean, Gilead hasn't really been around for that long. We talked about this in class, but here's my theory, and just for as an aside, and we'll come back to talking about Serena Joy, but Offred mentions that when their daughter was 11 months old, just before she started walking, a crazy woman tried to steal her from the shopping cart at a store. Okay, so there's one thing that we have is their daughter was 11. Then a little bit later, Offred, in the more of the present tense of the story, says that her daughter must be about 8 now. So a period of 7 years. So this is really not a huge amount of time that has transpired. We also learn that Aunt Elizabeth mentions that they're a transitional generation, that the handmaids are transitional, and it's going to be they're going to be the life for this set of handmaids is going to be the worst because they have memories from before, and all the handmaids that come after this is going to be easier, right? This is really a new thing. This is not a well-established, long-lasting civilization, Gilead, right? Okay, so let's jump back into Serena Joy. So Serena Joy, we learn she has a different name too. Her original name was Pam, but she changed it in the time before Gilead. She was some sort of evangelist singer who ended up touring the country advocating that women stay at home and mind the house. This is probably, we could sort of infer that what she was doing was supporting what her husband was doing, the commander, which was probably lobbying for Gilead. We can guess that whatever she was doing or lecturing about was controversial enough to sort of, end up at the point where people made attempts on her life. And we know that somebody tried to shoot her and hit her secretary instead, and that somebody put a car bomb in her car. We also know that she suffers from arthritis, and she's really not thrilled to have Offred in the house. Yeah, that's her in a nutshell. Cora and Rita, those, as I mentioned, are the two Marthas. Rita is the older and grumpier. I think it says she's in about her 60s. Cora's younger, a little bit more tender or naive, and probably relatively close to Offred's age. Other than that, I don't think we ever learn very much about them. We don't learn much about their history. Similar with Nick, we know that he's the trusted chauffeur. Lean, kind of mysterious. He must be attractive because Offred has a thing for him. He's obviously also complicit in the black market and hence illegal actions of both the commander and Serena Joy. And we'll learn more about him later. I don't want to give too much away. Moira, probably one of my personal favorite characters, is one of Offred's friends from the time before. She's irreverent, she's rebellious, she's loud, she's witty. Somehow she ends up at the Red Center. She can't stand it. She makes a couple escape attempts and finally does escape the Red Center in this sort of brazen, not very well planned escape. However, it seems to succeed. And again, we'll go into more of that later. Offred often brings up Moira or thinks of Moira when she needs confidence, so when she needs to conjure sort of strength or calmness, right? So then, I guess the last kind of main character, maybe I should have mentioned this with the classes of people, are the ants. And the ants are obviously not directly related to any of the handmaids. They wear khaki, so there's another sort of color thing, sort of neutral. And they are basically the teachers at the Red Center. They are there to indoctrinate the handmaids. We can assume that they were chosen because they're zealous believers in Gilead. They're older, they're strict as nuns, which again, you can think of the way that the handmaids' outfits are described. They're kind of like this perversified type of nun, which is part of the oddness of the way that the handmaids dress, right? And yeah, so and that's kind of it, right? The other couple of things that we talked about in class, we talked about ownership, and I mentioned it here a little bit, of who can own what. And I think that's really why Offred wants to steal something. She wants something that belongs to her other than her hope, her memories, and her name. That's really all she has. And we also talked about space. It's clearly defined space. And space, again, is territory, is something that we have, and sometimes in more of an abstract sense. So Offred has her room, and she has that moment where early on where she decides that the room is hers and she'll consider it hers. Serena Joy has the sitting room and the garden. The commander has his office. Nick has the car. Rita and Cora have the kitchen. This is very segmented, compartmentalized society, which is why people feel so distant. I think it's important to note that religion here does not seem to be a true religion so much as kind of that opiate of the masses type idea, where it's used to justify decisions. So I'm going to end there just for this first one. Again, just to give you guys some context, a little bit more context, some things that we've talked about. Partially for the first response paper, but that's almost a moot point now because it's almost done. But for response paper number 2 and for the Socratic seminar, I'll try and do another video lecture like this before our Socratic seminar to give you guys a little bit more food for thought and clarify some things. But yeah, I think that's it for now.